What if the Prodigy played UK82 punk? Find out on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name is Morgan Brown, and for the past few months I've been making a series of videos which I call What If videos. The idea of these is that every week I take a popular song and imagine a different set of circumstances or a decision that someone's made that causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know. I then take the original isolated lead vocal of the song and record my own backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I've got to hand to actually make that version a reality. So this week I took on the song Firestarter by the Prodigy and did my best to turn it into a UK82 punk song. Now, for anyone of my age, the Prodigy were probably a pretty important part of your teenage life, whether you liked them or not. I was very much on the rock side of things, started listening to heavy metal when I was 9 years old and then got into punk when I was about 14. But whatever you were into, the Prodigy were pretty much an inescapable cultural force. I guess, like many people, I became aware of them when they started having hits from the music from the Jilted Generation album. As I say, I wasn't a dance music fan, so I didn't really kind of pay that much attention to it, but definitely aware of it. It was very much happening. It was really with Firestarter that they moved sideways into the kind of territory that I was a fan of. And that really, initially, I think, came from Keith Flint, the late Keith Flint, moving over from just being a dancer to actually handling vocals on Firestarter. He's got this really post-Johnny Rodden punk rock snarl to his voice. And to go along with that, they started using a lot more kind of guitar-y textures as well. I guess the mid-90s was quite the dark time for a heavier, kind of edgier sphere of guitar music. A lot of people who were into that kind of thing were sort of casting around looking for what was going to happen next. And certainly for a while it looked like the Prodigy were kind of pointing the way for where guitar music was going to go next. I remember reading a lot of Kerrang articles and things suggesting that sort of the fusion between punk guitars and this kind of high energy dance music was going to be the future of music. I don't know if that really panned out that way, but if nothing else, it certainly caused a lot of people who have been fairly closed-minded in the kind of metal and punk community to engage with some different sounds that they hadn't really thought about before. So yeah, they had a little run of songs which kind of really did cross over, aided particularly in the live performance by the addition to the live lineup of one Gizbutt, which is a great name, formerly of the English Dogs, and I think at the time and still now of Janice Stark on lead guitar there. A great guy. Ran into him at a gig that I played in Peterborough a few years ago. He was really cool. As I say, still touring with Janice Stark, and also saw him this year playing second guitar for Washington DC's Scream, who were fantastic. But yeah, so I think he kind of lent them some real kind of punk rock clout and credibility as well. So really my thought with this video was imagining a scenario in which, rather than just adding some punky vocals and some kind of punk rock guitar to their electronic sound, if the Prodigy had kind of got a bit carried away with the punk thing, gone the whole hog and completely converted to being a punk band. And with them kind of bringing in Gizbutt, as I say, formerly of the English Dogs, who were at least initially part of the wave of UK punk bands that we called UK82, I thought, well, you know, maybe they could actually become a UK82 style band. If you're not familiar with UK82, I'm going to try and just give you a little bit of a potted history of that. I know a lot of mainstream accounts of punk kind of start with either the Ramones or the Sex Pistols in 1976 and then claim that punk basically ended in 1978 when the Sex Pistols broke up and then nothing happened until Nirvana. But in actual fact, an awful lot of punk hadn't even really started up by 78. At that point, it was only really filtering out into the world beyond London. A lot of the regional scenes in the Midlands and North were only just kind of getting a start there. So after that first wave of punk bands, you get bands who are a bit less arty, a bit more street level coming through. I'm thinking people like Sham 69, the UK Subs, the Ruts, who are all still very much kind of going strong when that kind of first wave of punk bands is splitting up or changing styles. Added to that, around that time, you've got the rise of Motorhead, who I think are really important in this. I mean, I don't think people generally think of Motorhead as being a punk band. Probably more associated with heavy metal. I wouldn't really say they were either. They're pretty much just a fast, dirty rock and roll band, really. But that kind of looser, scrappier, more aggressive style of heavy rock really plays a massive role in the future of punk. Particularly when The Damned, one of the notable first wave British punk bands, the first British punk band to release a single and an album, they split up after their second LP and founder member Brian James leaves. But then it's only a matter of months really before they're doing reunion gigs without Brian James, with Captain Sensible, the original bassist, moving over the guitar. And who do they get to stand in on bass in his place? Lemmy from Motorhead. And it's very telling that when they eventually come back and start releasing records again, although Lemmy didn't stick around, obviously, I think that album, particularly Love Song and the title track Machine Gun Etiquette and a few other songs on that, laid a bit of the groundwork for what became UK82 and indeed all of hardcore punk, taking the original punk sound and just turbocharging it. So following that, you get all these more street level UK scenes growing up out of the end of the 70s into the 80s. There are a few parallel scenes developing at the same time here. On the one hand, you've got the anarcho-punk scene that comes out of what Crass have been doing. So aggressive punk bands with a very strong anarchist political ideology. At the same time, you've got the Oi scene developing, which I guess is the bands that followed in the footsteps of the likes of Sham 69 and Cock Sparrer. Skinhead punk bands, a bit of pub rock thrown in there as well. And sort of in between these two styles, you get what we call UK82. At the time, it wasn't called UK82. I guess people would have just thought of it as street punk, or possibly when the term started to be used, hardcore punk. The actual term UK82 comes from a band called The Exploited, and it's a track from their second album, Troops of Tomorrow, I've got here. The Exploited, certainly, I mean, for a lot of people, they're kind of almost a cartoon of punk rock, but really influential. A lot of the imagery that people associate with punk rock, like the people with the brightly coloured Mohicans, they tend to think of that as a 70s thing, but really that became the popular look as a result of bands like The Exploited particularly. And they're still a massively popular band today. As I say, they always seem kind of cartoony. I never paid too much attention to what they were saying. Recently, a friend of mine shared some information which I wasn't familiar with about them. Namely, there was an interview from back in 1984 with lead singer Watty saying some horribly racist things. And you might think, well, it was a long time ago, he was young and stupid, maybe he's grown and got better. But then he also shared some photos of him much more recently, hanging around with some known neo-Nazis. And so, yeah, Watty, not a good guy, and it kind of makes me think I don't really want to be listening to this stuff anymore. So yeah, off that goes. The more interesting guy actually out of The Exploited, and probably the reason why they musically didn't really do anything worthwhile after 1984-ish, was Big John Duncan, who, after leaving The Exploited, after the Let's Start a War album, ended up in Goodbye Mr. Mackenzie, a very un-UK82 band with Shirley Manson, who later went on to front Garbage. And then after that, he ended up as a roadie for Nirvana and played for Nirvana as well when Kurt Cobain was injured for a while. Other UK82 bands, much less problematic as far as I'm aware. GBH, great band, originally charged GBH and then they dropped the charged. Again, really influential band, barreling, heads down punk rock with a strong Motorhead influence, big pummeling riffs, massive influence on a lot of the kind of thrash metal scene that was coming up shortly after this. And then definitely got to mention Discharge. Discharge became a genre unto themselves. There's a whole genre that sprang up called D-Beat, with bands who mimicked and then developed their sound. But really interesting band, kind of straddled the divide between the UK82 and the anarcho-punk scene. So really political lyrics about the horrors of nuclear war and these absolutely killer riffs that, if anything, moved the genre further away than anyone else from more traditional rock and roll stuff and towards what became the sort of discordant sound of thrash metal. So that's all the kind of music that I was taking into account and trying to imitate when I was making this record. So as usual, started out by taking the isolated vocal. Now I couldn't find a clean isolated vocal anywhere on the internet for this, so I had to isolate it myself. I used an app called Soundify, which I think uses AI in some way, shape or form to separate out the frequencies that the vocal is on from the rest of the record. So it's a really messy, horrible vocal. Thankfully, it's a really noisy track that I made, so it kind of masks that a little bit. In case you were wondering, that's the only use of AI that it ever happens on any of these tracks. There's a guy on Reddit, after I posted this video, who basically said that, oh, I just generated the track by AI. Not at all true. The original vocal is the original vocal. Everything else I make. So I program the drums, I play all the instruments, whether I can play them or not. I do my best to learn them and I play them. No AI involved whatsoever. That would defeat the point of this whole thing. So arranged, played, produced by me. No AI in sight. Yeah, that really ticked me off. So I just wanted to make sure that's nice and clear. So I separated out this vocal, synced it up to the tempo grid. I decided we wanted to keep it short and sweet, so I just completely lost the last verse. Sped everything up because I wanted to make sure we were at full-on thrash tempo. I didn't want to dawdle around with this either. And then I programmed some drums in, went for a bit of a discharge gallop there. Didn't over-tighten anything, just kept everything fairly noisy and fairly rough. Put some bass on there. I went for a fairly gnarly, kind of distorted, Lemmy-ish kind of tone. And then fired a couple of guitar tracks on there. The guitar riff that I went for, tried to base it on the notes of the guitar sample that's in the original record to some extent, just to make sure I wasn't just completely inventing the music. I wanted it to have some kind of relation to the original track. So I popped a couple of rhythm guitars on there, panned left and right. I've got a third one that comes in right down the center on the second and third choruses. They're all fairly gnarly and distorted, but I tried to just give each one of them a distinct sound so that when they all blend together, they make a really big kind of combined sound. I decided to pop a guitar solo on there. I didn't want to do anything too flashy really because it's UK82. We're trying to represent, fairly unschooled musicians, which isn't to say that there weren't good players in UK82. There's plenty of them, but I didn't want it to be a metal solo, so it's actually two overlapping tracks with slightly different sounds because I thought that sounded cool. It's aggressive and kind of angular without being shreddy in any way. And then I wanted to have some backing vocals on there because I think on the original track there's some kind of sampled and manipulated vocals going on in between lines of Keith's vocal. I didn't want to have to start shouting hey, hey, hey at the top of my lungs in my flat because, as I think I've said on pretty much every one of these videos, I've got neighbours and I don't want to upset them. So I thought, well, how am I going to deal with this? Luckily, I found a sample that I could use from an existing record, not of the UK82 genre. I actually took some vocals from We Want the Same Thing by Belinda Carlisle. I mean, Belinda Carlisle has roots in punk, not UK82, but by that point she was definitely fairly far removed from punk. I just snatched those three hays from the start of that record, tweaked them around a bit, pitch shifted them down, distorted them a bit to make them sound a bit less polished. I think it kind of sounds a little bit like some UK82 backing vocals if you don't listen too closely. And that's about it. Like some of these other tracks I've done, there's countless layers. For what I was doing here, it didn't really need it. It just kept it nice and simple. And I think it sounds pretty well like a sort of thing that could have popped up on a Punk and Disorderly compilation back in '82. Enjoyed doing the video as well. I combined some footage of the Prodigy themselves from, I think it's an old Phoenix festival, and intercut it with bits of GBH from the early 80s and also a Chaos UK gig for some of those crowd shots. And I think that looked pretty cool too. So let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed what I've done, please like and subscribe. And if there's anything else you'd like me to do in any future videos, any artists you'd like me to have a look at, any songs you'd like me to take on, or any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, please do let me know in the comments. And otherwise, that's all. And thanks very much. And I'll see you next time.